All right, solving inequalities. Let's solve x minus 6 is greater than or equal to negative 11. The last two examples that we were given, we didn't have to solve anything because the x was already by itself. But now we're going to actually use our rules in solving equations to finish up and solve this inequality. So just like I want to get the x by itself when I'm solving equations, I want to get the x by itself when I'm solving inequalities. So I'm going to add 6 to both sides, the same thing that I was doing when I solved equations. And I have x is greater than or equal to, this is different signs, so I'm going to subtract, take the sign of the bigger number. Now this looks just like our problems did at the very beginning. So I want to graph the solution set on a number line, and then I'm going to write it two different ways. I'm going to write it in set notation and interval notation. So let's graph this. Remember, your negative infinity is to the left, your positive infinity is to the right. And I'm going to go ahead and just write a couple of numbers just to give you an idea of where this is located. Now you have to remember if you want a bracket or a parentheses. So let's look at our inequality symbol. I have a line underneath it, so that means I'm going to use a bracket at negative 5. Now let's look in the direction it's pointing. It is pointing to the right, so that means I'm going to shade to the right with my bracket. So I got a bracket at negative 5, and I'm shading in that positive infinity direction. Now, the set notation just means you're writing your solution over again. Your x is greater than or equal to negative 5. Sometimes they'll ask you for this on your homework, not very much. So if you ever see something that says x and then a line, don't just write the greater than or equal to negative 5. Go ahead and write the entire solution that you have found, that x is greater than or equal to negative 5, in your solution set. So that's how you do set notation. It's pretty simple, exactly what you think. The interval notation is what we were doing before. So remember, your interval notation will match your graph perfectly. So the first thing in my graph is a bracket. That's going to be the first thing in my interval notation. It started at negative 5, so I'm going to write a negative 5, and I shaded all the way to positive infinity. And remember, your positive infinity will always have a parentheses. All right? Let's go ahead and continue and do another example on your next page. So the next problem we're going to have is solve 3x is greater than 9, and we're going to do the same thing. We're going to graph it and write the answer in interval notation. All right? So this one's just a one-step problem. If I'm trying to get the x by itself, I want to divide both sides by 3, the same number. So x is greater than 3. Now if I want to graph that, I have negative infinity to the left, positive infinity to the right, and just making a couple of numbers so you can see what's going on. Remember, you want to see if you're going to use a parentheses or a bracket, and it doesn't have a line underneath it, so that's going to be a parentheses, and it's pointing to the right, so I'm going to shade to the right. So parentheses at 3, and I'm shading to positive infinity. So I have, in interval notation, the first thing in my graph is going to be the first thing in my interval notation. So I have a parentheses at 3, and I'm going to go all the way to positive infinity. And remember, your positive infinity always has a parentheses. Now, I'm sure you have forgotten because it was the very beginning of the first page, but we have a new rule. And remember your new rule, and I'll bring it back up. Your new rule, when you multiply or divide both sides of the inequality symbol by a negative number, your inequality symbol flips or changes directions. We are actually going to use that rule in this next example. So, remembering our new rule, let's go ahead and look at our next example. The negative 2x is less than or equal to 10. So I am going to solve just like I solved with equations, and I want to get the x by itself. So I want to divide both sides by negative 2. This is what our rule meant by when you multiply or divide both sides of the inequality symbol by negative. I am dividing both sides by negative. This is still going to just be x, and this is still going to be negative 5. Those things won't change. But this time, my inequality symbol, instead of pointing to the left side, is now going to be pointing to the right. So this is what it means by the inequality symbol will flip or change directions. So if it was once pointing to the left, it will now be pointing to the right. If it was pointing to the right, it will be pointing to the left. So it just changes the direction. Now, if you forget to do this step, your graph and your inequality interval notation will be completely wrong. So it's very important for you to remember your new rule. Remember, negative infinities to the left, positive infinities to the right. I have -5, -6, -7, -4, -3. Remember, you want to use, you got to figure out if you're going to use a bracket or parentheses, and because I have a line underneath it, I'm going to use a bracket. And since I'm pointing to the right, I'm going to shade to the right. So I have a bracket at -5, and I'm shading all the way to positive infinity. So my interval notation will match this graph completely. The first thing on my interval notation is a bracket. Then I write -5, and it goes all the way to positive infinity. And remember, positive infinity or negative infinity both always have parentheses. Now I'm going to stop it there, and we're going to pick up with the rest of it in the next video.